Hi everybody, now we're going to talk about the Renaissance. Hopefully you watched the intro video and explain why we're talking about it. It's really important to understand why in a modern history class we're going over something that starts in 1450 CE or AD. Trust me, it's worth it. Alright, so the Renaissance was the period that followed the Middle Ages, medieval period. If you don't remember that from your history class, medieval period is the stuff that's going on with like knights in shining armor, like if you saw Lord of the Rings or any of the stuff filmed around that, what's supposed to be like that time. That's basically what you're thinking of. Okay. So the Renaissance is after that. Basically what happens is the Black Plague destroys their faith in the church and the governments and everything they have, and they start looking for answers in other places. They have a renewed interest in things of the world. They realize life is short, doesn't matter. You need to kind of enjoy what you have. Really hate the saying, but you might be familiar with it, of YOLO. That's kind of how they felt. You only live once. Anyways, so they take an interest, and by they I mean most of the Europeans, but really it's a worldwide thing. The Europeans, remember those continents, Europe is one of them, they kind of take credit for all this, even though it's really a bunch of stuff from around the world that they only just discover. So they start taking an interest in human beings and their conditions. Education, art, literature, and science are now going to be the dominating focus. And look at it. Doesn't this kind of describe your school life? You have art, literature, science, math, history, all that stuff. This lasts until 1600 CE, when it's kind of just what's normal now. It's not this period of great changes, but it leads to a bunch of different changes. Okay, so we need to kind of do this. So how do major changes lead to more major changes? And this is what the Renaissance does. It's starting to focus on other things, and it just kind of starts a chain reaction that leads to the modern world. So we're going to explain changes in European and world culture and power during the Renaissance, and we're going to evaluate examples of cause and effect during it. These are our standards. You can go ahead and contact me if you want to see more about what those are and what they mean. But it's really going to be pretty straightforward once we get into all this. Now, we're saying the Europeans to us, do they do this by themselves? No, this is a world effort. During the medieval times, the Dark Ages, there hadn't been much emphasis on learning. Some of their best books and best bits of literature, great pieces of art, great pieces of science were destroyed. But the people, we say Arab scholars because this is the time when the Muslim empire spans from Western Africa all the way through China. They had preserved all these things and said, no, these are books that could be useful. So Europeans learned to study with Arab scholars and then bring the techniques back with them. Okay, so all of this has a great deal to do with the Middle East. The word Renaissance itself means rebirth, showing that, yeah, we kind of had these ideas, but we let them fade. It's kind of like when you start off really well in school, you don't do so well, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, my grades are coming up soon. I really got to get back in that. That's a rebirth of your passion for learning. Okay. So people basically lost their faith in the church because the church was the dominating force at the time, meaning the church was what most people lived for and died for and worked for. Now they said, maybe there's more than just the church. And they start looking at human beings and stuff on this earth rather than worrying about what happens after you die. One of the big biggest culture changes is that they valued humanism, okay, which is just the focus on human interests and values, not necessarily, angels and things like that. They believe human beings have dignity and intelligence. That's not the first time they thought of it, but it's really the push for it. It's something that lasts with us today. The ability that we can change the world, make it a better place for everybody. You don't need the church to go and do it for you. I'm saying you don't need what the church stands for, but you don't need the church building and people itself. One of the ways they kind of thought of this, that this was spreading, was the Gutenberg Bible. So, named for Johannes Gutenberg, a German inventor, basically makes it so that books don't have to be handwritten out every time. Okay, you can actually have a machine to put it together and just print them out. So books are no longer these really expensive things. Before this, books basically cost the equivalent of a car would be today. They call it the greatest single innovation in the history of communication. You'll hear that. You don't have to believe that exact fact, but just know people might bring that up. Gutenberg's inventions and the spread of cheap printed materials created a huge change. The only way you would know about these things before is if someone thought it was important enough to write it down. You would have to want to pay enough for it to hear it. Now, no, you can just spread little sheets. It's kind of like the difference between having a textbook was and being able to post something online now. Cheaper, easier, so it is a lot more convenient to hear different ideas than if you have to wait till the textbook gets updated. You also notice that's one of the many reasons we don't have textbooks in this class. But change goes to all realms of society. Helped develop an increase in world literacy. Before then, most people couldn't read. Ideas from around the world spread. You could be in China reading about something that was happening in West Africa. You could be in Europe and reading about something that happens all the way in, for example, India. It really helps spread that so the world becomes more connected. Books are circulated to the public. Best example of this, Shakespeare. I know you might not like his works. I personally do, and hopefully you do as well, but if you don't, that's fine. The world is made of different opinions. That's what makes it great. But his sonnets and ideas really get people to start thinking about the way they view things. Okay, so that's why it's important. And you'll notice the common theme throughout this has been the church and science. There is much more of an emphasis on science and much less of an emphasis on the church. This is because people started to become educated. They started asking questions that they didn't really ask before. And with that, you naturally tend to challenge authority. Like a 2-year-old. When you're a baby, you don't say, your mom or your dad tell you to do something. They literally will pick you up, make you do it. Eventually, you grow old enough and you start saying, your brain starts connecting the dots. You say, wait a minute, why do I have to go to bed at 7? You're challenging that authority. And that's why some parents deal with that very harshly. Some of them view it as a positive thing. It happens. But challenging authority naturally happens as we become more educated. Now, that doesn't mean just because you're smarter, you're going to go ahead and start fighting the police. That's not what that means. It means you start asking questions, and then you have to say, well, why do you have the power? And a lot of times there's a good reason why we've given power to other people. Sometimes we have to start thinking, well, maybe we shouldn't have given them that. We need to take it back. But that comes much later. Okay, this is just the start of it. Okay, one of the biggest people that you'll hear with this is called the Reformation. Remember, Renaissance is this whole period of change. Reformation is reforming the church. Reform, that's where it comes from. Martin Luther, if you hear about people say, oh, I'm a Lutheran, this is where it comes from. Spoke out against the selling of indulgences, which were these things that the Roman Catholic Church in Europe was doing. Basically said, yeah, you sinned and it's bad, but pay us money and we'll forgive you of it. He said the governments had the right to deal with the church. Today we call that separation of church and state in America. No, it's a variation of it. They said you don't need a priest in this whole hierarchy of people between you and, the Creator. You can do it by yourself. And I know today you're like, all right, that's fine. I know there's a bunch of churches, they said that. But no, this was revolutionary at the time. Again, part of being history is understanding that they didn't know things that we do back then. Education is a major change. They learned through imitating others, and what they thought were some of the greatest people at the time were the ancient Greeks and Romans. So they start emulating what they do, and they expand upon it. And one last thing we're going to go over is just this last bit here. They had the belief that a well-educated person knows a little bit about everything. You no longer were just a farmer. You could farm, but also know how to build things. You could also know about politics. You could speak Latin. That's a Renaissance man. That's where we get that term. One of the other things that we're going to talk about later in this pod is how it leads to the age of imperialism. Basically, people in their own country say, hey, we've been stuck forever. Now we're getting to learn more. What else is out there? And before, you only really had Europe, Asia, and Africa as what was the quote-unquote known world. They really didn't understand that there was anything else. And so they start exploring, and that's when we start hearing about Latin American cultures like the Aztecs, the Incas. Now, those people had been there forever, but there hadn't been any communication between those two groups. That's why sometimes you hear people talk about, the U.S., North America, and South America is the New World. Yeah, the world is just as new and just as old as the rest of it. It's just that they hadn't really thought about it or interacted with it. Alright. This is part of what we call the scientific revolution. We challenge what we think about the world itself. We start learning about the universe, saying the Earth is not the center of it. It's something like over like 1 trillion years from galactic central point as we know it today. Back then they thought the Earth was the center and everything moved around it. Now we know that's not true. You might have heard of Galileo. He was threatened to be killed if he didn't take back his discoveries that, the Earth isn't quite the be-all, end-all of it. So it's a major change, and it leads to people rethinking not only science, but the way we respond to people that challenge how we believe. Okay. And that's it for this video. The quiz is below. Feel free to reference this, start and scan through the video to get something that you needed. Okay. And when you're done, go onto the main page, do the rest of the assignments, and once you feel comfortable with all of that, go ahead and move on to Renaissance Art. Alright, as always, feel free to contact me. All my information is going to be over there on the left side of the page when you look at this. Any of those things are a good way to contact me. They're valuable. I look forward to hearing from you.